The small Massachusetts courtroom buzzed with tension as 78-year-old Walter Simmons sat quietly at the defendant's table. His weathered hands rested on his lap, one thumb absently tracing the outline of the medal tucked safely in his pocket, a habit formed over decades. "Mr. Simmons, do you understand why you're here today?" Judge Leonard Hoffman's voice carried an undercurrent of irritation. The judge, a man in his early 50s with perfectly styled hair and a custom-tailored robe, had been growing increasingly impatient. Walter nodded. "Yes, Your Honor, the parking dispute with Bellevue Towers." The property management company had filed a lawsuit against Walter for repeatedly parking in a reserved space near his daughter's apartment building when he visited to help with her 2 young children. The space belonged to the building manager, who had pressed charges after multiple warnings. "Mr. Simmons, this court's time is valuable. This is the 3rd rescheduled hearing because you failed to secure proper representation," Judge Hoffman said, shuffling papers with obvious annoyance. Walter cleared his throat. "I apologize, Your Honor. I was hoping to resolve this without following proper legal procedure." Judge Hoffman interrupted. "That's not how this works." The building manager, Marcus Reynolds, sat smugly at the plaintiff's table, his attorney whispering something in his ear that made him smirk. Walter's daughter Emily squeezed his shoulder from her seat behind him. She had begged him to let her hire a lawyer, but Walter had insisted he could handle it himself. At his age, he didn't see the point in spending money on attorneys for something so trivial. "Your Honor," Walter began, reaching into his pocket, "I'd like to explain that I only parked there when bringing groceries to my daughter after her surgery. I have this letter from her doctor, confirming—" As he pulled out the letter, his medal slipped onto the table with a soft clink. The small bronze star caught the fluorescent light. Judge Hoffman's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Simmons, are you attempting to sway this court with some old memorabilia?" Walter quickly tried to return the medal to his pocket. "No, Your Honor, it fell out accidentally." "May I see that?" Judge Hoffman extended his hand, and the bailiff collected the medal, bringing it to the bench. The judge examined it with a dismissive glance. "Is this supposed to impress me, Mr. Simmons? Some Veterans Organization Participation Award?" A few people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. Walter's face flushed red. "It's a bronze star, Your Honor. From Vietnam." Judge Hoffman placed it down on his bench with visible disinterest. "That's worthless in this courtroom, Mr. Simmons. Your military history has no bearing on your repeated violations of private property rights." The judge's words stung worse than any physical blow. Walter had never used his service for special treatment, had never even talked about it much. But to hear his sacrifice dismissed so casually made his chest tighten. "Now, regarding the matter at hand," Judge Hoffman continued, "Mr. Reynolds has documented 7 instances where you parked in his reserved space despite multiple warnings." Walter opened his mouth to speak when the courtroom door at the back opened. A tall man in a crisp military uniform entered silently. His presence commanded attention as he walked down the center aisle with measured steps, his shoes clicking against the floor. Emily turned to look, her eyes widening in surprise. Walter didn't notice, keeping his gaze fixed on the judge. "Mr. Simmons, do you deny these allegations?" Judge Hoffman asked. "No, Your Honor, but I'd like to explain the circumstances." The uniformed man had reached the gallery railing now. The medals and insignia on his chest identified him as a full colonel in the United States Army. He stood at perfect parade rest, his face impassive as he observed the proceedings. Judge Hoffman finally noticed the newcomer, his expression shifting slightly. "Can I help you, Colonel?" "Colonel James Harrington, Your Honor," the man replied in a deep, authoritative voice. "I apologize for interrupting your court, but I'm here regarding Mr. Simmons." Walter turned in his seat, confusion evident on his face. He didn't recognize the officer. "And what is your interest in this case, Colonel?" Judge Hoffman asked, his tone noticeably more respectful. "If the court would grant me 2 minutes, I believe I can provide relevant context that may assist in your deliberations, Colonel Harrington replied. Judge Hoffman paused, then nodded. Very well. Please approach. As the colonel walked forward, Walter felt a strange sense of dread mixed with curiosity. His mind flashed back briefly to rice paddies and helicopter rotors, to the sounds and smells that still visited him in nightmares after all these years. Colonel Harrington approached the bench, but instead of speaking quietly to the judge, he turned to face the courtroom. Your Honor, with your permission, I'd like to address the court regarding Walter Simmons. Judge Hoffman, clearly intrigued by the unexpected military presence, nodded. Proceed, Colonel. Thank you. Colonel Harrington stood with perfect posture, his voice carrying throughout the room. I'm not personally acquainted with Mr. Simmons, but I know his service record intimately. It recently came to the attention of my office that he would be appearing in court today. Walter's brow furrowed in confusion. He hadn't spoken of his military service to anyone involved in this case. Walter Simmons served as a combat medic with the 101st Airborne Division in Vietnam, Colonel Harrington continued. On April 14, 1968, during the aftermath of the Tet Offensive, his unit came under intense enemy fire near Hue. The courtroom had fallen completely silent. Judge Hoffman's previous dismissive expression had vanished. Despite sustaining shrapnel wounds to his leg and shoulder, Specialist Simmons crawled through active enemy fire to reach 4 wounded soldiers who were pinned down in an exposed position. Over the course of 3 hours, he provided life-saving medical care while using his own body as a shield. Walter stared at his hands. He'd never told this story to Emily, had barely allowed himself to remember it. When extraction was finally possible, Specialist Simmons refused evacuation until all other wounded were aboard. The helicopter took fire during takeoff, and Simmons was struck again while physically covering a wounded lieutenant. Colonel Harrington reached into his breast pocket and removed a folded document. For his actions, he was awarded the Bronze Star with V device for valor, and subsequently the Purple Heart for wounds received in combat. However, due to an administrative error that was only recently discovered during a records review, Mr. Simmons never received a second decoration that was approved in 1969. Walter looked up sharply. This was all news to him. The colonel approached Walter, standing directly before him. Mr. Walter Simmons, on behalf of the United States Army and a grateful nation, I am here today to correct a 56-year-old oversight. Emily gasped audibly behind him. Walter felt his heart pounding. The medal that Judge Hoffman is currently holding is indeed a Bronze Star, awarded for valor in combat. What Mr. Simmons never knew was that his commanding officer also recommended him for the Distinguished Service Cross, our nation's second highest military decoration, for the same actions. That recommendation was approved but never processed. Judge Hoffman was now looking at the small bronze medal in his hand with completely different eyes. Colonel Harrington turned to face the judge. Your Honor, the medal you referred to as worthless is a symbol of the highest ideals of service and sacrifice that our nation holds dear, and it represents only a fraction of this man's contributions. The judge's face had drained of color. Marcus Reynolds and his attorney sat frozen, looking increasingly uncomfortable. Colonel Harrington then addressed the courtroom at large. Mr. Simmons saved the lives of 7 American soldiers that day. One of those soldiers was my father. A murmur went through the courtroom. Walter felt light-headed as memories flooded back. The lieutenant he'd shielded had been named Harrington. Could it really be? My father passed away last year, the colonel continued, emotion finally breaking through his professional demeanor. His last request was that we find the medic who saved him in Vietnam and ensure he received proper recognition. It took us months to track down Mr. Simmons, who has never sought attention or recognition for his service. Emily was openly crying now. Walter felt her hand gripping his shoulder. Your Honor, Colonel Harrington said, turning back to the bench, I'm not here to influence your legal proceedings. The law must take its course. But I am here to correct the record about Walter Simmons' service and to finally present him with the Distinguished Service Cross that he earned through extraordinary heroism. Judge Hoffman cleared his throat, visibly affected. This court will take a 15-minute recess. Colonel Harrington, Mr. Simmons, please remain. As the judge rose and exited to his chambers, the courtroom began to buzz with conversation. Marcus Reynolds leaned over to whisper urgently to his attorney, his previous smugness completely evaporated. Walter sat stunned, the past and present colliding in his mind. He remembered the young lieutenant, badly wounded, but still trying to direct his men. Harrington, after all these years. Dad, why didn't you ever tell me? Emily whispered, her voice breaking. Walter shook his head slowly. It wasn't something I wanted to remember, and it wasn't something I wanted you to have to think about. Colonel Harrington approached them again. Mr. Simmons, I know this is unexpected. My father spoke of you often throughout my childhood. You were the reason I joined the army. When we found your name during the records review, it felt like fate. Walter looked up at the colonel, seeing traces of the young lieutenant in the older man's eyes. Your father was a brave man. He said the same about you, Colonel Harrington replied. Always said he owed his life to a medic who wouldn't leave him behind. The courtroom remained in a state of hushed anticipation as Judge Hoffman returned from his chambers. His demeanor had transformed completely, the earlier arrogance replaced by a solemn respect. The court will now resume, Judge Hoffman announced, taking his seat. Before we continue with the case at hand, I believe Colonel Harrington has official business to conduct. Colonel Harrington nodded gratefully and moved to the center of the courtroom. A junior officer who had quietly entered during the recess now approached, carrying a polished wooden box. Mr. Simmons, would you please step forward? Colonel Harrington requested. Walter rose slowly, his joints protesting after sitting tensely for so long. Emily gave his arm a gentle squeeze of encouragement as he made his way to stand before the colonel. Attention to orders, Colonel Harrington began formally, unfolding an official document. The President of the United States has authorized the award of the Distinguished Service Cross to Specialist 5th Class Walter James Simmons for extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed hostile force in the Republic of Vietnam. The colonel read the full citation, detailing Walter's actions on that fateful day, how he had crawled through a hail of enemy fire to reach wounded comrades, administered life-saving treatment while exposed to danger, and shielded others with his own body during evacuation. As the words filled the courtroom, Walter was transported back. The oppressive heat, the deafening noise, the metallic smell of blood mixed with jungle vegetation. The weight of Lieutenant Harrington as Walter dragged him to the helicopter, the searing pain as bullets tore through his own flesh. Specialist Simmons's extraordinary heroism and devotion to duty were in keeping with the highest traditions of the military service and reflect great credit upon himself, his unit, and the United States Army. Colonel Harrington completed the citation and nodded to the junior officer, who opened the wooden box. Inside, on a bed of blue velvet, lay the Distinguished Service Cross, a bronze cross with an eagle in the center, suspended from a ribbon of blue and red. It is my profound honor to finally present you with the Distinguished Service Cross, Mr. Simmons, Colonel Harrington said, carefully removing the medal from its case. Though it comes decades late, the valor and sacrifice it represents are timeless. As the colonel pinned the medal to Walter's jacket, the entire courtroom spontaneously rose to their feet. Judge Hoffman stood as well, his hand moving unconsciously to his heart. Walter, overwhelmed by the unexpected ceremony and the flood of long-buried memories, struggled to maintain his composure. His eyes glistened with unshed tears as he saluted Colonel Harrington. a gesture that came automatically, despite the half-century since he'd worn a uniform. "Thank you, sir," Walter said quietly. Colonel Harrington returned the salute crisply. "No, Mr. Simmons, thank you. My father lived to see his children grow up because of you. I exist because of your courage." The moment hung in the air, powerful, redemptive, before Judge Hoffman gently cleared his throat. "If there's no objection," the judge said, "I'd like to resume the proceedings regarding the matter between Mr. Simmons and Bellevue Towers." Walter returned to his seat, the new medal heavy on his chest. Colonel Harrington took a seat in the gallery directly behind him, a silent presence of support. Judge Hoffman turned his attention to Marcus Reynolds and his attorney. "Does the plaintiff wish to proceed with this case?" Reynolds had been whispering frantically with his lawyer since the recess ended. The building manager looked distinctly uncomfortable, shifting in his seat as all eyes turned to him. "Your Honor," Reynolds' attorney began, rising to his feet, "in light of new information, my client would like to withdraw the complaint against Mr. Simmons." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge Hoffman raised an eyebrow. "Is that so? And what new information has led to this decision?" The attorney glanced at Reynolds, who nodded slightly. "My client was unaware of Mr. Simmons's extraordinary service to our country and his personal circumstances. Mr. Reynolds feels that this matter can be better resolved through direct communication rather than litigation." Judge Hoffman's gaze was penetrating. "I see. And this sudden change of heart has nothing to do with the public relations nightmare that would come from continuing to pursue a decorated war hero over a parking space." Reynolds' attorney had the grace to look embarrassed. "Your Honor, my client simply believes that—" "I think I understand perfectly well what your client believes," Judge Hoffman interrupted. He turned to Walter. "Mr. Simmons, are you amenable to having this case dismissed?" Walter nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." "Very well." Judge Hoffman straightened his papers. "This case is dismissed. Mr. Reynolds, the court strongly suggests you find a reasonable accommodation for Mr. Simmons when he visits his daughter." Reynolds nodded quickly. "Of course, Your Honor, we'll designate a visitor spot near the entrance specifically for Mr. Simmons. See that you do." Judge Hoffman's tone made it clear this wasn't merely a suggestion. As the judge prepared to adjourn, he paused, looking directly at Walter. "Mr. Simmons, I owe you a profound apology. My earlier remarks were inexcusable. That medal, both medals, represent the very best of our nation's values. They are far from worthless. They are beyond price." Walter nodded his acceptance of the apology. Two moved to speak. "This court is adjourned." Judge Hoffman brought down his gavel, then stepped down from the bench. To everyone's surprise, the judge walked directly to Walter and extended his hand. "My father served in Korea," he said quietly. "He would be ashamed of how I spoke to you today. I hope you can forgive my ignorance." Walter shook the offered hand. "There's nothing to forgive, Your Honor. We all have our moments." As the courtroom began to empty, Marcus Reynolds approached Walter hesitantly. "Mr. Simmons," he began awkwardly, "I want to apologize personally. I had no idea. I mean, if I had known—" "It's all right," Walter assured him. "It was just a parking space." Reynolds shook his head. "No, it wasn't just a parking space. I was being petty and inflexible. Please, use any parking spot you need when visiting your daughter. In fact," he added, reaching into his pocket and producing a card, "this has my direct number. If you ever have any issues at Bellevue Towers, call me immediately." After the courtroom cleared, Walter sat quietly with Emily and Colonel Harrington in the now empty gallery. The Distinguished Service Cross gleamed alongside the Bronze Star on Walter's jacket, physical reminders of a chapter in his life he had tried for decades to keep closed. "I still can't believe you never told me, Dad," Emily said, her voice gentle but hurt. "All these years, I never knew." Walter sighed, patting her hand. "Sweetheart, There are parts of war that shouldn't follow you home. I wanted you to know me as your father, not as a soldier who saw terrible things." "But you're a hero," she insisted. Walter shook his head. "I just did what needed doing. The real heroes are the ones who didn't come home." Colonel Harrington cleared his throat. "Mr. Simmons, my father, felt the same way. He rarely spoke about Vietnam, except when he talked about you. He said he owed everything to the stubborn medic who wouldn't let him die." Walter smiled faintly. "Your father was quite stubborn himself, kept trying to direct his men, even with a bullet in his shoulder and shrapnel in his leg." "That sounds like him," Colonel Harrington laughed. "Stubborn until the end." His expression grew more serious. "Mr. Simmons, there's something else I'd like to discuss with you if you're willing." Walter raised an eyebrow questioningly. "The Army has a program where veterans speak to medical personnel training for combat deployment," Colonel Harrington explained. "Your experience would be invaluable to young medics preparing to serve. Would you consider sharing your knowledge?" Walter hesitated, the idea of revisiting those memories voluntarily making his heart race. For decades, he'd pushed the war down deep, mentioning it to no one, acknowledging it only in the dark of night when nightmares forced their way through his defenses. "You don't have to decide now," Colonel Harrington added, seeing Walter's discomfort. "But I believe you could make a difference, just as you did for my father." Emily squeezed Walter's arm. "Dad, think about it. All these years you've carried this alone." Walter looked down at the medals on his chest. Perhaps it was time to transform the weight of those memories into something positive. "I'll think about it," he promised. As they prepared to leave, Judge Hoffman approached them again. The judge had removed his robes and looked markedly different, humbler, more human. "Mr. Simmons," Judge Hoffman began, "I've been a judge for 15 years and I've never had a moment in my courtroom like today. It's made me realize how easily we can misjudge people when we only see a small part of their story." Walter nodded in understanding. "We all do it, Your Honor. We're only human." "Still, I hope you know how deeply I regret my words," the judge continued. "My father would have—" "Judge Hoffman," Walter interrupted gently, "you've already apologized and I've already accepted. Let's leave it at that." The judge smiled gratefully and extended his hand once more. "Thank you, Mr. Simmons." But as they finally left the courthouse, the bright afternoon sunshine felt symbolic to Walter. Emily walked beside him, her arm linked with his, while Colonel Harrington followed a respectful step behind. "Dad," Emily said softly, "would you tell me about it sometime? Not for me to judge or pity, but just so I can understand this part of you." Walter considered her request. For so long he had believed that silence was protection, for himself and for those he loved. But today had shown him that some stories, however painful, needed to find their way into the light. "I think I'd like that," he said finally. "Not all at once, maybe. But yes, I'll tell you." Colonel Harrington cleared his throat. "Mr. Simmons, I've taken the liberty of arranging a small reception at the local VFW post. There are several Vietnam veterans there who would be honored to meet you. Only if you're comfortable, of course." Walter was surprised by how appealing the idea sounded. After decades of avoiding his past and the community of veterans who might understand it, he suddenly felt ready to step back into that world, not to relive the trauma, but to honor the bonds that had been forged in those difficult days. "I think I'd like that very much, Colonel." As they walked toward Colonel Harrington's waiting car, Walter reflected on the strange journey of the day. He had arrived at the courthouse expecting a simple resolution to a trivial matter. Instead, the past he had tried so hard to bury had resurfaced in the most unexpected way, bringing not the pain he had feared, but a kind of healing he hadn't known he needed. The medals on his chest caught the sunlight. For the first time in decades, Walter felt their weight not as a burden, but as a reminder of strength he had forgotten he possessed. "You know," he said to Emily and Colonel Harrington, "I've spent 50 years trying not to think about Vietnam. Maybe it's time I remembered the good parts, too. The lives saved, the bonds formed." "I'd like to hear those stories," Emily said, smiling up at her father with new understanding. As they reached the car, Walter paused and looked back at the courthouse. What had begun as one of the most humiliating moments of his life had transformed into something he could never have anticipated. A reconnection with a part of himself long forgotten, and perhaps the beginning of a new chapter. "Ready, Dad?" Emily asked. Walter nodded, straightening his shoulders slightly, the two medals gleaming against his jacket. Ready. And for the first time in many years, he truly was.